This is a speech by Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, who is on June 30th, 1936, heading into Geneva to speak to the League of Nations, which arose after World War I, because Italy is about to invade his country, and he wants help. I, Haile Selassie I, Emperor of Ethiopia, am here today to claim that justice which is due to my people, and the assistance promised to them 8 months ago, when 50 nations asserted that an aggression had been committed in violation of international treaties. There is no precedent for a head of state himself speaking in this assembly, but there is also no precedent for a people being victim of such injustice and being at present threatened by abandonment to its aggressors. Also, there has never before been an example of any government proceeding to the systemic extermination of a nation by barbarous means, in violation of the most solemn promises made to all the nations of the earth, that there should be no resort to a war of conquest, and that there should not be used against innocent human beings the terrible poison of harmful gases. It is to defend a people struggling for its age-old independence that the head of the Ethiopian Empire has come to Geneva to fulfill this supreme duty, after having himself fought at the head of his armies. I pray Almighty God that he may spare nations the terrible sufferings that have just been inflicted on my people, and of which the chiefs who accompany me here have been the horrified witnesses. It is my duty to inform the governments assembled in Geneva, responsible as they are for the lives of millions of men, women, and children, of the deadly peril which threatens them, by describing to them the fate which has been suffered by Ethiopia. It is not only upon warriors that the Italian government has made war. It has, above all, attacked populations far removed from hostilities in order to terrorize and exterminate them. At the beginning, towards the end of 1935, Italian aircraft hurled upon my armies bombs of tear gas. Their effects were but slight. The soldiers learned to scatter, waiting until the wind had rapidly dispersed the poisonous gases. The Italian aircraft then resorted to mustard gas. Barrels of liquid were hurled upon armed groups. But this means also was not effective. The liquid only affected a few soldiers, and barrels upon the ground were themselves a warning to troops and to the population of the danger. It was at the time when the operations for the encircling of Mekelle were taking place that the Italian command, fearing a rout, followed the procedure which it is now my duty to denounce to the world. Special sprayers were installed on board aircraft so that they could vaporize over vast areas of territory a fine, death-dealing rain. Groups of 9, 15, 18 aircraft followed one another, so that the fog issuing from them formed a continuous sheet. It was thus that, as from the end of January 1936, soldiers, women, children, cattle, rivers, lakes, and pastures were drenched continually with this deadly rain. In order to kill off systematically all living creatures, in order the more surely to poison waters and pastures, the Italian command made its aircraft pass over and over again. That was its chief method of warfare. The very refinement of barbarism consisted in carrying ravage and terror into the most densely populated parts of the territory, the points farthest removed from the scene of hostilities. The object was to scatter fear and death over a great part of the Ethiopian territory. These fearful tactics succeeded. Men and animals succumbed. The deadly rain that fell from the aircraft made all those whom it touched fly, shrieking with pain. All those who drank the poisoned water or ate the infected food also succumbed in dreadful suffering. In tens of thousands, the victims of the Italian mustard gas fell. It is in order to denounce to the civilized world the tortures inflicted upon the Ethiopian people that I resolved to come to Geneva. In October 1935, the 52 nations who are listening to me today gave me an assurance that the aggressor would not triumph, that the resources of the covenant would be employed in order to ensure the reign of right and the failure of violence. I ask the 52 nations not to forget today the policy upon which they embarked 8 months ago, and in faith of which I directed the resistance of my people against the aggressor whom they had denounced to the world. Despite the inferiority of my weapons, the complete lack of aircraft, artillery, munitions, hospital services, my confidence in the League was absolute. I thought it to be impossible that 52 nations, including the most powerful in the world, should be successfully opposed by a single aggressor. Counting on the faith due to treaties, I had made no preparation for war, and that is the case with certain small countries in Europe. War then took place in the atrocious conditions which I have laid before the Assembly. In that unequal struggle between a government commanding more than 52 million inhabitants, having at its disposal financial, industrial, and technical means which enabled it to create unlimited quantities of the most death-dealing weapons, and, on the other hand, a small people of 12 million inhabitants, without arms, without resources, having on its side only the justice of its own cause and the promise of the League of Nations. What real assistance was given to Ethiopia by the 52 nations who had declared the Rome government guilty of a breach of the covenant and had undertaken to prevent the triumph of the aggressor? Has each of the member states, as was its duty to do in virtue of its signature appended to Article 16 of the Covenant, considered the aggressor as having committed an act of war personally directed against itself? I had placed all my hopes in the execution of these undertakings. My confidence had been confirmed by the repeated declarations made in the Council to the effect that aggression must not be rewarded and that force would be compelled to bow before right. In December 1935, the Council made it quite clear that its feelings were in harmony with those hundreds of millions of people who, in all parts of the world, had protested against the proposal to dismember Ethiopia. It was constantly repeated that there was not merely a conflict between the Italian government and Ethiopia, but also a conflict between the Italian government and the League of Nations. And that is why I personally refused all proposals to my personal advantage made to me by the Italian government, if only I would betray my people and the covenant of the League of Nations. I was defending the cause of all small peoples who are threatened with aggression. What have become of the promises made to me? As long ago as October 1935, I noted with grief, but without surprise, The three powers considered their undertakings under the covenant as absolutely of no value. Their connections with Italy impelled Italian aggression. On the contrary, it was a profound disappointment to me to learn the attitude of a certain government which, whilst ever protesting in its scrupulous attachment to the covenant, has tirelessly used all its efforts to prevent its observance. As soon as any measure which was likely to be effective was proposed, various pretexts were devised in order to postpone even consideration of that measure. Did the secret agreements of January 1935 provide for this tireless obstruction? The Ethiopian government never expected other governments to shed their soldiers' blood to defend the covenant, when their own immediate personal interests were not at stake. Ethiopian warriors asked only for means to defend themselves. On many occasions, I have asked for financial assistance for the purchase of arms. That assistance has been constantly refused me. What, then, in practice, is the meaning of Article 16 and of collective security? Apart from the kingdom of the Lord, there is not on this earth any nation that is superior to any other. Should it happen that a strong government finds it may, with impunity, destroy a weak people, then the hour strikes for that weak people to appeal to the League of Nations to give its judgment of all freedom. God and history will remember your judgment. Representatives of the world, I have come to discharge in your midst the most painful of the duties of the head of a state. What reply shall I have to take back to my people? Okay. So this did not turn out well. Ethiopia had been independent for quite some time, we'll say, and was one of the areas of Africa not heavily colonized. The Ethiopian highlands had resisted European pressure for centuries at this point. If I have that correct, I think that's, what's going on there. And they managed to keep their own, culture, history, kings against the outpouring of European aggression. The insidious gunboat diplomacy was a little harder to achieve when you're up in the mountains. And Ethiopia had been in a government surviving all by itself when the Europeans arrived. So it managed to resist somewhat. However, it was conquered by the Italians because, there weren't many other places for the Italians to go at this point. Africa had been pretty well carved up by agreements between the Europeans. And so it's 1936, just a few years before World War II starts out, and Europe has problems of its own, let's say, and there's all these campaigns in North Africa, and eventually Italy is defeated, and Italy gives up its overseas conquests. That's what I understand happened, and Ethiopia becomes independent again. Haile Selassie returns as emperor, takes over, and you have the Rastafarian religion, I think. Rever him as a sort of messianic figure. But at this point, during this speech, he's just a guy trying to keep the country independent. He notes here, that Ethiopia is 2 million people, and Italy has 40 million people. And Ethiopia does not have money, does not have guns, does not have a industrial economy. Italy is waging war thousands of miles from its own borders. And this isn't one gunboat. This is an army. This is, as he names it, dozens of aircraft. This is a huge endeavor. And we have the League of Nations basically standing by and saying, too bad, so sad, we aren't doing anything. Now, this is something that happens whenever we are faced with collective action, I would say, right? If we all band together and say a attack upon any one of us is an attack upon all of us, then that has either one of two effects, I would say, on average. One effect is to stop aggression, right? We don't attack each other. We arm our borders against the people outside us, but in the interior group, we don't have to fear being invaded. And just by having a League of Nations, just by having an agreement, just by having a treaty, that doesn't guarantee such activity. So the other response comes after that. Either you stick to the terms of the agreement and you slowly grow more integrated, right? Because if you don't have to arm your borders, then cross-border trade grows rather swiftly. And capital, instead of being invested in castles and armies, ends up being invested in, roads, water purification plants, factories, houses, shipbuilding apparatus, beautiful statues, and that sort of thing. Because that's just how capital investment works, right? You have a bunch of stuff and you're constantly building and building and building more and more and more. And if it doesn't go to armies, it goes somewhere, which means that theoretically it benefits everyone involved. If you don't have to worry about being attacked, then you can grow and grow and grow. However, the other possible way that can go is, instead of cooperating with your neighbors, you want to take advantage of them. You want to free ride on this. You want them to defend your own borders where you refuse to defend their borders. You want them to invest in their economy and grow and grow and grow it, where you take an aggressive stance towards this situation. And you have like salami tactics. You have bits where you annex this area and that area because you are defending a group of people who are persecuted in there. Or it has historically been yours. Or, you purchase a piece of land using your resources, but don't allow anyone to purchase land, and don't allow other people to purchase your land, and you slowly grow. You may seek to shift the means of your military expenditures. Instead of tanks, for example, you invest in spies. You invest in intelligence. You invest in massaging governments around you and controlling them gently instead of attacking and so on. And so you have a sort of insidious weakness inside this grouping of pure collective defense, which seeks to take advantage of it. Okay? And then you have groups who are not important at all, right? Like Ethiopia is not important to the League of Nations. It is small, it is weak, it has no resources, it has a very little voice. No one's going to come to its defense. He mentions in here, he doesn't expect anyone to come to his defense. doesn't expect troops to be sent. All he wants is the weapons to fight his own war, which is, sort of what happened in modern times in Ukraine, right? There was never any expectation that like NATO would send troops into Ukraine. The expectation and the practice so far has been sending money and tanks and so on. We saw in World War II, we also saw this, where the U.S., before it joined Britain against Germany, would send supplies over in the Lend-Lease Act. But those are situations outside the direct agreement, right? Those are special situations where, like, Ukraine isn't part of NATO. Britain was allied with the U.S., but the U.S. wasn't involved in the war. It's a little more interesting when we get to the inside of it, right? Like, if, for example, Russia invades Lithuania tomorrow and NATO does nothing, then that suggests that that NATO falls apart. That all the small countries in NATO start running for the hills and start forming their own alliances and start finding ways to appease the Russian bear because they don't think because no one's coming to their defense, and they were relying on that collective defense. Finland might be better off. I was there a while ago, and it seems a very difficult place to conquer, to say the least. But I've also been to Lithuania and Latvia, and they're small countries with lots of rivers. Not in a great position. And Ethiopia is in a position like that, comparatively weak compared to a strong possible aggressor. It also, I've been talking about NATO and war and battles, but League of Nations is more like the UN, right? Or is it more like NATO? It's an interesting bit. So I should look up more information about this, but for the moment at least, what is the purpose of something like the UN? Is it a forum for agreements? Is it a forum where we can meet and have collective action? What does it have to do with defense? What does it have to do with the rights of one country to, determine its own destiny, the rights of the people to govern themselves? Because one thing that is seen today as a weakness of the UN would, I think, be the Security Council. Especially during something like the Cold War, you have great powers who, if they choose to be aggressive, can block any security guarantees by the UN. Because they have that veto power. So all the UN can do is economic sanctions, or do legally at least, is economic sanctions and strident talks. We have this problem in Israel, for example, today, where, or maybe not, you have this event in Israel today, which is the most obvious example, I'd say, of a situation like this, where you have massive votes for censuring Israel, but the U.S. constantly voting to veto those actions, right? Voting on the opposite side. So it ends up being just words and words and words. You have individual parts of the UN, like the International Criminal Court, which act independently, which is something of an interesting state, because something like an international criminal court creates a sort of international government, that can do things, that can activate a sort of, this happens with the IMF as well, right? An international group that focuses on financial stability, for a country or a region or the planet. And while it receives funding from individual states, it acts outside the action of those particular states. It acts, more or less by itself. So we can see the UN and these bits and pieces of the UN as an idea for creating an international governance, and doing what you can with that power. Where instead of arms and battles and weapons, you use the other abilities at your legal disposal, which is basically economics and strident words, right? So we have so something like the Security Council also makes an interesting case, because the feeling, at least from my perspective of the UN, is that certain countries matter more than others. Certain countries have more of a voice. This might be because they have a place in the Security Council. This might be because they have a special relationship with the UN historically. It might be because they give a lot of funding to the UN, for example. It might be because they helped write the rules of the UN, for example. And this is the case for any collective organization. To balance the powers of all groups within a collective organization is a very difficult and delicate task. And we can see this just in the United States, where we came up with the two houses of Congress and the Senate in an attempt to balance some of the smaller states' power along with the larger states' power, so that nobody lost too much in the congruence, in the growth of the nation, right? Rhode Island didn't want to be completely voted out and outgunned and have no say whatsoever when New York decided it wanted something. But to hold that together is a delicate and difficult task, because the natural tendency is for groups to form within that larger group, right? The Europe contingent, the African contingent, the South American contingent might happen, in geographic terms. You might also have groups which form along certain lines, that want free trade, or that want to reform immigration, or which are in favor of climate change, not in favor of climate change, right? You may have groups like China and Russia who wish to form areas of control, areas of influence, or of outside influence. I mean, the U.S. is guilty of this too, right? Of going in and just straight up deciding which side of a civil war they want to support. And the UN has had places and times where it was very effective. I don't know about very effective, but in the Balkans and certain countries in Africa, Rwanda is the one I know of off the top of my head. It's been relatively successful, as in it wasn't a complete disaster. But there are also times, like recently, there were UN troops in southern Lebanon, and when Israel and Lebanon started fighting, the UN troops just left, got out of the way. So you have to ask, how effective were they in stopping fighting or halting fighting? Once fighting began, they didn't do anything, but you were into counterfactuals. What would have happened if they had not been there? What would have happened to Palestine if the UN had never given a negative resolution? regarding that. What would have happened to the world if if the Soviet Union and the United States hadn't had a forum for discussing, nuclear capabilities? It's interesting. It's interesting reading a speech like this because it's both a part of the past and a part of the future, right? It suggests what is going to happen in 1945 and 1940 and so on. That war is changing. And now, instead of some battlefield troubles, you are going to have the destruction of cities, the attacks on civilian populations. We are entering now into a world where you don't capture the enemy king in the field of battle and then ransom him for 2 years worth of gold and silver and take over a few castles. I'll take over Alsace-Lorraine and a humiliating treaty. No, this is the time period of complete capitulation. This is the era where the colonial mindset starts to take over, right? Like the Soviet Union is going in and saying, we are going to overthrow from within certain governments and turn them communist, and we're going to do this in such a fashion because we know what is best for them, and it is total, complete, utter control. Instead of it being some far-flung country on the other side of the planet, taking over Brazil or something, it's going to be, we're going to take over Poland because it's next door. And then the claims made in that case the reasonings behind it are different. Instead of, we can do this, or the Pope gave it to us, or those poor savages, it's more along the lines of, those poor peasants we have to save. It's the same claim, right? It's the same idea. It's the same outlook upon the world. I know better and I know best. And the UN at least does present a forum for the complaints about that. It presents a way where you can say, look, we recognize there is a group of countries who recognize this particular country, and it existed, and that it is a people, and that people can come to the UN and speak and meet the rulers of other nations and become involved in treaties, agreements, right? Like, if you can join all sorts of international gatherings and all sorts of meetings and plans and systems, and here's a loan for this and a loan for that, and do you want to fight climate change, do you want to work on trade agreements? You can enter into situations like, if you don't have to simply be a country that no one really knows much about, which interacts with a few places on the planet which are near to it, but on the other side of, there may be some French Guyana, right? Or Chile, or, Madagascar, Sri Lanka, the Gambia. These are small countries that I don't really know anything about, but I could go and look up something like, would they vote on this particular UN resolution or that resolution? What are they agreements? Are they part of this agreement or that agreement? Has someone in their government given a speech at the UN? It is a place where you can find out about other, you can become acknowledged. And I feel like that is partly a response to historical colonialism. Like Haile Selassie is standing up in front of the planet, essentially, and saying, I exist, I was here, and even if I'm, beaten down and I lose, at least I tried. And you can't say that I wasn't educated, that I wasn't willing to fight. You know, you can't say that I traded my country for a few blankets and beads, right? I'm here, and even if my country is being attacked, and even if my country is at war, he manages to get to Geneva. Right? We see this even today, where we'll have Trump and Putin meeting in Alaska, even though Russia is in the middle of a war, right? So I wonder how we are changing in the future, because in the Cold War between the Soviet Union and America, you had UN resolutions in places like South Korea, where the U.S. went in to enforce it, or at least that was the claim and the idea. You also have that in some place like Iraq. That was the claim, as I was reading about a few weeks ago, that the UN had a resolution at some point and the U.S. was just enforcing it. So the UN can also act as a sort of casus belli, because they did something in the past and now you're pulling it up in the future. And any group or organization is generally reluctant to invalidate a previous decision it has made. If you're going to censor a country, it's going to be 25 years until you uncensor the country. That's just, that's bureaucracy. It's not moving very fast. So today, I wonder how much it has changed. I wonder how much support someplace like the UN actually gives to foreign countries which are under attack. I have read that there is a theory of Africa, that the UN was rather effective in policing the wars, or in producing pressure which mitigated, let's say, wars between nation states which changed borders substantially. You didn't have the rise of large empires in Africa immediately after the countries achieved independence. You had a bunch of smaller countries, which is sort of an interesting effect to have. I mean, have the days of empire passed? Or are the days of empire still to come, just in a different fashion, in a different way, right? If you can persuade something like the UN to have a conflicted view towards, let's say, the invasion of Ukraine, then you can stand up and say, look, there are these countries who support us, or these countries who think that that Ukraine should not receive support, or there are these countries who, for one reason or another, for one logic or another, claim XYZ, claim ABC. And if the outcry is not universal, then what is to be done, right? All right, and today we have, the issue with Israel, where the outcry against Israel towards Gaza is not universal. Just one person, one country standing in the way or standing against it or saying that they have a different point of view doesn't change things. And then you have actions like, if you start to boycott a country, what is the mechanism for doing that? It goes against the spirit of the UN, because you'd have a outcast country with no means to talk to anybody. It used to be something like North Korea. It has to have its own diplomatic agreements, or seeks to have its own diplomatic agreements. This is another question. I guess this sort of speech really makes me want to look into the history of UN interactions as it is. I know my comments here are rather confused. It's one of those bits where I want to think, because I assume I know what the UN is doing. I assume I know what the world is attempting to organize itself around. I assume I know what's going on. But then when I get down to the actual activities, I'm like, I can name 2-3 groups. I have sort of an idea of like what the IMF does. And I know they're sort of linked to the UN. And I know that there are all sorts of groups in the UN. And I know that there are all sorts of support, right? Recently in the US, we were receiving news about, stopping foreign aid. And part of that foreign aid goes through the UN because the United States funds part of that aid. And then if you're fighting like tuberculosis, or you're trying to improve crop yields in India, or you are trying to shift farmers away from cocoa beans and poppies in South America or Afghanistan, then it seems reasonable to think that the UN would be involved, or some UN group could be involved in all of those. But it does feel, and it has generally felt, that even if the UN is effective in helping or policing, perhaps, or putting pressure on smaller countries, it has generally been ineffective towards larger countries. The USA, Russia, China can, to a great extent, ignore anything the UN does or wants them to do. Partially, I do wonder how much of that is due to their veto on the Security Council. Like, they don't have to worry about invasion. I mean, honestly, here, Italy is attacking Ethiopia, but the most likely outcome is they win, they take over Ethiopia, and even if other European countries are censoring them, are giving speeches in the UN, are boycotting certain economic parts of their trade with Italy, Italy can say, hey, look, we have allied with another country, Germany, in this case, I understand. And it turns out that together we have a trade going on, and we don't need the UN, right? The UN isn't important enough. It's not well bound enough to actually have an effect. So you need not just collective action, but collective action at a large enough level that it is capable of having an effect. If Britain and Argentina decide to boycott South Africa, that does not mean they're going to have a great effect, because South Africa, even if it's hurt, has the ability to pivot to another part of the world, to pivot to different suppliers, because it's so big and large. So the effects you would expect from 2 or 3 smaller countries joined together in any group whatsoever are much smaller than the effects you would expect from a larger group, of course. But with a larger group comes a loss of cohesion. So theoretically, all the UN countries would have an interest in collective defense, right? Would have an interest in keeping their borders secure. And even if you argue about trade and rights, these are, to me, it appears, primarily secondary to keeping your territorial integrity. So I do wonder, as I read this, which is actually the case, right? Because we hear about trade agreements and rights and intellectual property protections and lenders of last resort, these sorts of things from the UN. That's what's loud. This country's doing something bad, that country's doing something bad. I don't know what's going on here. There's a war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Armenia and Turkey aren't talking to each other. And let's say, Russia is interfering in Germany. Iran is supporting 3 different groups of terrorists in the Middle East. And the UAE is doing something in Africa. Saudi Arabia is messing with, God, what's it, the little horn down left of South of Arabia, down left of Arabia, messing with that bit. And then you have, anywhere you look, problems going on and disagreements. The South China Sea is a hot spot. Where then you have things like the ICC, the International Criminal Court, putting up Netanyahu on charges. And then they also put up Duarte from the Philippines on charges as well. And I think they're being charged at this point in time. Read that a few weeks ago. So I want to end this sort of by asking, what's the point? Right? Is the point of something like the UN for a forum, to be a forum where people can meet and agree with each other and express their own ideas and independence and claims? And it does act in that case as a sort of anti-colonial outlook, in that it's very hard to declare that we are attacking, the Navajo, and nobody cares, right? When the Navajo have a representative in some world organization standing up and saying, "We exist, we are here," right? You need to have that demands the group attacking us has a casus belli, has a sort of reason for war. It may be a bad reason, but even requiring your enemy to have a bad reason to attack you is better than your enemy needing no reason whatsoever to attack you. Is what it seems to me. So a forum also acts as an anti-war group, and the UN, how well does it do that? I know UN peacekeepers are few and far between. I remember reading years ago about someone who had acted as a UN peacekeeper in some war in Africa, and they had orders not to engage. So what would happen is there was a cordon where UN peacekeepers were stationed along the edge of this cordon, and any refugees fleeing from the fighting who got inside, who crossed over the line, were protected. That is, the belligerents had agreed not to attack anyone inside this refugee camp the UN had made. But what was happening is that this soldier was unable to move from his position, was unable to fire at anyone was on his site. What was just sort of a wooden post standing there, demarcating a space. And I still remember reading this. He would stand there, and there'd be women and children and mothers carrying their kids and that sort of thing, running towards him across this field and getting gunned down by soldiers behind them. He'd be standing there, and there'd be some guy 30 feet from him, pulling his knife out and stabbing someone, 30 times, and you cutting off their head and waving it as a trophy, and then laughing at the UN soldier. I'm going, Jesus, Diavaras, how do you survive in that situation? Like, how do you not lose your mind and you're standing there thinking, I am protecting somebody, at least I'm doing some good, and even if I can't help everybody, at least I have this, right? As a UN soldier, as a peacekeeper, what must be that be like? Standing there thinking, I came here to help people, I'm doing it, but I'm also, standing by and watching this terrible thing happens. I know that the UN can be involved in refugee crises and handing food over, but I've also heard stories of, like UN sends in food trucks, and they have to be bribed, and sometimes they're stopped, and there's this threat of, of interference, of troops, but I often wonder, how much good does that actually do? How much does something like the UN being involved in a situation reduce the cost of war? Because as this speech by Haile Selassie makes clear, there is a difference between battles between soldiers on a front and battles of a population, or acts of terror which target entire cities, or poison the food supplies and the waters and the cows and the sheep, and make it so the bread you eat is deadly 3 days later as you're running around starving, trying to survive. And we don't want that, right? I mean, here in the United States of America, we've never had a situation quite like that within living memory. But I've certainly read horrible events. And, I'm reading one again here. I mean, I'm reading one in the news. I'm reading 2 or 3 in the news today. I could look and find something like that going on. As war turns from battles between armies to battles between populations, between peoples, where entire cities are destroyed, or where you have something like Haiti, where the government no longer exists, various gangs have taken over, you have a few thousand troops from Africa being sent as policemen and not being, as I understand it, terribly effective, as the entire world just sort of, shrugs and says, well, we can't help put a country together. It's not important enough. It doesn't affect us. Right? And that's the bit which I wonder how that brought down the League of Nations. The idea that an event which happens halfway around the world, in Ethiopia or in Haiti today, for example, doesn't affect how the more powerful countries run their businesses and run their daily lives and expect the world to go in the future. But, does it? We live in a time of proxy wars. We certainly did during the Cold War, where you didn't have direct fighting between large, powerful countries. You had support for various groupings inside countries, where you pushed for the people you wanted to be in charge, and you gave them support and guns and so on. So that is, in a way, what Haile Selassie is asking for, right? Just give me some money, give me some guns, let me defend myself. That is, raise the cost for the Italian government to attack me. You don't have to forbid them entirely. You don't have to wage war upon Rome. But if you raise the cost of war high enough, then you reduce the number of wars and battles that go on. Or at the very least, you reduce their terrible, desperate strength. Because if the fighting gets too bad, you can always have this forum of the UN. You can always have an expectation that you can call upon, like, UN peacekeepers, for example, to enforce a peace, or at least to stand there and demarcate a space, create distance between two groups, which is sometimes all you need for fighting to die down. So today we enter an age of rising uncertainty, with a retreating U.S., with a belligerent Russia, with a rising, or to a great extent risen, China. And what place does the UN have here? We don't yet, I think, quite have an Ethiopia moment, but we seem to be very close in several ways. You always have the issues between China and Taiwan, for example, as a flashpoint. You have terrorist and anti-terrorist actions in the Middle East and North Africa, where there's a rising level of conflict. You have the problems between, I want to say, Venezuela and Guyana. I may have that wrong, but the oil fields, the Venezuelan government is trying to claim to their south as another starting point for conflicts. And we hope that none of these explode. We hope that none of these are a Sarajevo moment, for example. But we don't know. There is an important piece here which he talks about the secret agreements of January 1935. And that is one activity which I hope at least the UN has been successful in pushing to the side. Secret agreements between countries which can lead to a chain of events. The idea of, at least if military action is to be taken, that it needs to be defensive action. As yet, though, we'd be in a world, it appears to me, where the dangers or the idea of the UN has not been entirely challenged, but it has been pushed to its edge. Like I said, the sovereignty over Taiwan claim, the troubles in Gaza, the Ukrainian invasion. Even in recent past, the U.S. overthrowing nations in South America, sending in troops under secret missions, for example, is a flagrant violation of the whole idea. But it didn't take the world into world war. And I think that happened because, unfortunately, as this appeal of Ethiopia to stop aggression ends up pointing out by example, is that we still live in a world today where stronger countries matter more in decision-making, matter more in events, matter more in effect than smaller countries. Even many smaller countries sometimes. And so we have to ask, has the UN at least been effective in that sense? Has it stopped nuclear wars between large, powerful countries? And we also have to ask, has the UN at least slowed down colonial adventures? I would generally say yes. And what we expect to see as a result of something like that would be adventures by countries nearer their borders, is what I would say. Where ethnic conflicts or historical conflicts can be more confused, right? I mean, everyone outside of China is looking at China and Taiwan and going, okay, this is. I get like it's a complicated situation. There's lots of history. There's lots of views on both sides. Everyone is looking at Ukraine and going, okay, I there's groups that say, okay, I see why Russia has some idea or bit here in these two provinces, and like, okay, maybe they're totally wrong, and that goes back to World War II and the Soviet Union, and then moving people in, and then then it goes back to thousands of years ago, when the Kievan Rus, when that was going on, and they're pulling up that history, and I don't really know much about it. It just sort of goes on, and I don't know much about recent history between the two, and it's a big complicated situation, right? But we all are inoculated in the colonial mindset, or that we all recognize the colonial mindset, and we're like, okay, when you're taking over a country that's half the world away from you with military force, that's obviously a no-no. We've seen that. We know that's bad. And you have the UN as a forum for expressing that, so it's harder to keep it down in the down low. And what we might expect is, again, like regional blocks to form. But also, I would say the troubles likeliest to happen are going to be near at home, relatively small scale. And as that happens, the UN becomes less and less relevant, less and less powerful, less and less able to stop trouble. Because if your borders are expanding ever so, even slowly, then that means that the next country is near to you now, and the next country is near to you now. And all of a sudden, what happens is if you don't protect, if you have these big countries and you have smaller countries in between them that act as a sort of spacer, right? Act as a border where influence can be fought over through economic and political means, then you prevent military struggle between those large countries. But if the smaller countries become eaten up, then what happens is those large countries become closer and closer and closer to each other. And those large countries see other large countries taking over territory, which then inspires, the first large country to take over its own territory, to act more belligerently because it feels threatened. So the UN, even if it mostly helps or is controlled, I'm going to say, by these larger countries, then it is still in the interest of the smaller countries for the UN to exist and for the UN to be actively trying to stop wars and struggles, actively trying to create trade agreements, actively trying, acting as as a lender trying to stabilize worldwide economy, which is, all mixed up together. But I think it's also important to recognize that the moral claims of the U.S., the idea of a national agreement about how the world should be run, are somewhat separate from the practical claims of the purpose of the UN, which are that there is an optimum way for the world to be run without wars. And we wish to edge closer to that. This, of course, leaves many questions unanswered for the future. But the most likely danger in the near future I see for something like this attack on Ethiopia to happen and for the UN to completely ignore it is for it to be a moral issue which some groups of countries claim are muddled, which then paralyzes the activity of the UN. Or, but where you have one great country on one side and the rest of the world on the other side. And so, again, it paralyzes the UN, and it shows its ineffectiveness. Because the moral claims masquerade as the practical claims, but the moral claims are not as strong as the practical claims. So that if you have a practical reason for doing something in the UN, like protecting the borders of all the states, and then you cover that up with a moral reason, which is weaker than the practical reason, you end up weakening the practical reason as well, because you're trying to put a moral facade on top of it. You're adding an acid to what should have been solid steel, is the way I see it. The idea of Italy was able to attack Ethiopia because the members of the League of Nations did not actually believe in the idea of collective defense. They did not see it as relevant. And that came back to bite them rather badly, I would say. So it was less they may have had a strident moral view and given resolutions about what to do, but if they're not willing to, if the individual countries involved are not willing to act, then the resolution means nothing, And that is something I wonder if we may have a further evolution. Like, what's the next evolution of the UN? It's either going to become weaker and just a forum for moral complaints with no real force, or it becomes something which is more practical, where its effects can be seen and obviously understood. So far, even though the effects are obviously understood, much of its greatest results are either invisible, like the spread of technology, the reduction of disease, are powerful effects in the world, but ones that take place over decades, and they're always counterfactual. Like, what if you had not done this? What would have changed? Sort of issue. And well, this speech by Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia sort of shows what happens. World War II shows what happens when countries act individually without understanding how their individual actions affect collective results. And I would say, are still not there. Countries still have this strong tendency to look at things through their own lenses, through their own domestic politics, through their own immediate needs. And something like the UN or the League of Nations, if they are to have an effect, then I would argue that what they need to do is look forward into the future, be that voice which says, in 50 years or 100 years, what can we do? What will happen? But we'll see how this turns out. In the end, I wonder when the next speech like this will be given, or if it shall be given at all. I mean, who knows? The world is getting more dangerous, we generally feel, but that doesn't mean that we are at the end of our rope quite yet. That doesn't mean that the hope of worldwide organization, which supports collective action over long periods of time for the betterment of the entire human species, is a lost dream entirely. Just seems to have many, many stumbling blocks. And I would also say many unclarities regarding the good effects it has had. It's easy to criticize something like the UN for being ineffective because it does, I would argue, fail to do what its promise suggests it could do. But it does achieve some of that promise. And focusing in that, even though it is mostly counterfactuals, I do wonder how that changes the way we view such things. You know, especially as something like the United States of America, how do we think the UN will change in the next 100 years? And it generally seems to me, based on completely and only the news I read, is that the moral claims are overtaking the practical claims. You know, it's become a bit of a venue for complaints, and formal action hasn't been very effective. You know, to a degree, this all has to do with funding. You know, the U.S. has been a major funder of the UN, and as the U.S. funds the UN less and less, you have places like China funding more, and that changes the character of the UN. And when you have, you know, hundreds of countries in the General Assembly, but very, very few of them are able to do much beyond their own borders, then collective action becomes the only hope of collective security and advancement. Otherwise, it's just piece by piece, bit by bit. I don't know. It's a confusing, complicated, long, historical issue which we are still running through. And I will probably read more about that tomorrow, just for my own curiosity and education, as perhaps we all may want to do, lest we become Ethiopia in 1936.